transistors, changed everything in modern electronics. But tube amps are not modern electronics. They're really from a bygone era, and they are an anomaly where the vacuum tube still plays a vital role in the sound of what's coming out of that amp.
Right.
So, in general, we were talking about Marshall, and we'll talk about a couple of brands. But in general, design concepts are more important than specific brands and models. And when we're talking about amps, that means matching the amp's power tube type gets you closer than anything else to what you may want to achieve. And to do that and to understand that involves understanding a little bit about the tube basics. And we started to touch on this already. But we're talking about power tubes here. An amplifier has a preamp area inside of it and a power amp area inside of it. There are preamp tubes and there are power amp tubes. There's also a transformer and a bunch of other things. But the power amp tubes are the things that are responsible for a lot of the characteristic of the tones, certainly in the vintage, in the vintage amps. Things are a little different now. A lot of sound now comes from the preamp side. But back in the day, the sound of the amp was directly related to, and still is, the kind of power amp tube that was in an amp. And the big daddy for dyno music and 70s hard rock and 80s melodic metal was the EL34 tube, and they were made in Britain. It's also, it's amps with those tubes in them tend to have what we sometimes refer to as a British sound.
Okay.
So Marshall amps, Orange amps, Laney amps, High Watt amps, Sound City amps, they all used EL34s. And that was really, for the longest time, the sound of dyno rock.
Okay.
So the characteristics of that tube compared to some of the others that are, also important were that EL34 tubes run hotter, and distort earlier as you increase the volume of the amp.
Okay.
So what that means is as you turn up the amp's volume, let's say you're starting on 0. On a Marshall, typically you will start to hear the amp start to distort around 4, 5, 6, somewhere in that area on your way to 10, right?
Right.
Because that tube will heat up and start distorting at that level. There are other tubes that won't distort until you get all the way up in your volume. But what they wanted was to get this distortion. The distortion became very desirable in the music of the day that was being created. So EL34s, to give you some context, are the sound of Hendrix, the sound of Cream, the sound of The Who, the sound of Zeppelin, the sound of Sabbath, AC/DC, Van Halen, and a lot of 80s metal.
Okay.
Okay? So Hendrix and Cream used Marshalls. The Who were very big into high watts and Sound Cities before that. And Pete Townsend was also responsible for the Marshall stack before he had a falling out with Marshall and started using high watt amps.
Okay.
Black Sabbath is largely associated with Laney amps. AC/DC, straight up Marshalls. Van Halen in his early days in the first album in that era, pure Marshall. And a lot of the 80s metal, as I said, most of that stuff is Marshall as well, but it's all EL34 based amps.
Okay. But yet the sound between these bands are quite different because if you compare the sound of Van Halen to, by the way, rest in peace, what a shame. And
Absolutely.
I didn't saw that comment, man. I was bummed for the whole week when that news came out.
We all were. Yeah.
And, yeah. Poor guy didn't get that old. But he lived very hard and partied very hard, so I guess that's...
Well, not only that, it's like the man dies of throat cancer, and if you go back and all I was noticing, like when everybody's posting their tributes and posting pictures of him, it's almost impossible to see a picture of Eddie without a cigarette.
Yeah, yeah,
And
it's true.
he dies of throat cancer, and he always had this nonsensical story that, oh, my cancer came from me holding a metal pick in my mouth for a few years. No, it wasn't the cigarettes or anything, obviously.
Right. It's so weird that that guy like Lemmy. How old did he get? He got pretty old, right?
Older than Eddie, I think.
But he was like drinking like more than a bottle of whiskey a day since his 20s or something, and
I don't
he
know if that was true at the end. I'm
yeah.
not sure if it was true at the end. But certainly, a hard life with a lot of miles on those tires. Certainly.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But
But as
yeah.
you're right. Those sounds, all those sounds I mentioned, were fairly different. Now, whether you're talking Marshall, Orange, Laney, High Watt, Sound City, or any of the more modern amps that still use EL34 tubes, they all will voice the amp a little different than their competitors. So a Marshall sounds different from an Orange, and a Laney sounds different from a Marshall and an Orange, and a High Watt is different than those. They're using the same components, but they're making design choices that make the amp sound slightly differently.
That's in the preamp then.
No, that's in the power. Well, yes. Actually, I'm sorry. You're right. That part would be in the preamp,
Okay.
the voicing. Yes.
Okay.
All right.
So those are the EL
34.
34s. And what
Yeah.
else is there? Like what are other popular power amp tubes, or is that just the one?
Nope. There's more. We're going to only cover like I said, we're only going to cover the ones that are applicable to this style. But let me say that prior to 1981 and Marshall introducing the JCM 800, the distortion in the EL34 amps came from the power amp side, the tubes getting hot. This is sometimes called power amp saturation. Basically, you're running the amps at full volume or close to full volume so that these EL34 power tubes got hot and created the distortion.
Right.
Now, that said, you can say, well, wait a minute. What I hear from Hendrix and Cream doesn't sound like what I hear from AC/DC or what I hear from, except, those guys were using those amps too. How come they sounded, more metal? And the reason for that is in those days, extra distortion came from fuzz pedals and early distortion pedals.
Okay.
So if you're running an old Marshall, a Plexi or a Super Lead, and you turn it all the way up, you're getting a wonderful tone, but it isn't anything like you think of modern gain. It's still, think of more like it's like if you want to think of what one of those amps sounds like run full out, think of like the albums of AC/DC from the late 70s and early 80s. That's not the same levels of distortion that we got from metal bands later.
Right. And what you
It's
don't really hear on on those recordings necessarily is that it's so loud that it'll just almost tear the house down, right?
right, right. So the holy grail for amps was always getting this heavily distorted tone at a reasonable volume. So that was part of the evolution of what was going on here in the gear. But Hendrix would use, for example, a fuzz face to get some extra distortion. Jimmy Page used the Sola Sound tone bender. Tony Iommi and Brian May used something called a Dallas Rangemaster treble booster. Randy Rhodes and Accept used an MXR Distortion Plus. All of these things they put in as a pedal in front of the amplifier to make it distort even further.
Okay.
But the basic tone still remained an EL34 British tone.
Okay.
Okay. Preamp gain came in later with the JCM 800 and Mesa Boogies. At that point, what you have is an attempt by the amplifier companies to try and get these tones at a more reasonable volume. So you would have what was essentially a gain knob in addition to the volume knob, or sometimes they called it a master volume knob. And what that meant was you could turn up the amp's power amp section so it would get hot and distort, and then you would turn the actual volume of the amp back down to a more reasonable volume. And what would happen is you were adding preamp gain and taking some of the power stage gain out of the equation.
Yeah, so you could still get the distorted tone without bringing the house down.
Right, and it was a trade-off. It's not the same thing. There's something that happens when you run an amp at full volume. And by the way, we should also state that back in the day, in the 70s, especially, if you ran Marshall amps at full volume for the whole concert, if you didn't have like a fan blowing on the back of the amp, they would get so hot they would start smoking and blow up. And this was a very common thing. So guys would mod the amps to put a fan on the inside of the amp, or they'd just take a desk fan and they'd stick it behind the amp and blow it on the back of the tubes so that they kept it from blowing up.
Wow.
But I mean, you were literally running these things to the point of destruction to get this sound. And one of the things that Eddie Van Halen did, and people still try to do this, there's really no real decent reason to do this anymore, but back in 1977, when he was getting ready to record his album and all of that, he used this voltage variac device that would change the voltage so that he could change the voltage coming out of the amp and get that tone cranking at somewhat lower volume. It was an early attempt at attenuation, and a lot of the amps that exist from those days, I had one or two back in the day. They, you had guys who would do mods on your amplifier and put in an attenuator that would let you turn the actual volume down, but keep the amp running hot.
Okay.
But those were modifications. They weren't coming out of the factory that way. And
you can also
go ahead.
Sorry. Well, you can also put I forget what it's called. It's well, you can put something between the amplifier and the speaker that sort of...
The hot plate.
The hot plate, that's it, yeah.
Yeah, they didn't have those back then. Those don't come around that early. The Marshall Power Break and the THD hot plate and things like that, they came later. Again, there's something that happens when you run that amp full out. Aside from the power tubes getting very hot, the transformer gets involved, and that adds some complexity and dynamics to the sound. And what happens is when you start getting into amps that have multiple gain stages, they're shifting a lot of that distortion to the preamp tube, so that the power tubes don't run as hot. And these days it's a pretty good solution, but it really, you could always contend that something is lost if you're not running that thing full out.
Right.
And again, it's really a question of when it really matters. Does it really matter? If you're getting the distortion and you're happy with it, why blow up your amp? But this is, again, this is somewhat of a history lesson through where we've come from. We've got many ways to do this now. I mean, the other part of this is back in those days, if you wanted this sound, that was the only way you got it. Okay? If you were to buy any other kind of amp, like a PV practice amp or something like that were common in those days, some sort of small wattage, like 25 watt amp or something like that, they didn't get the sound. They had a different sound, but it was not that EL34 sound. That was not the authentic sound. You couldn't get it out of a practice amp. It was not available. You had to buy an amp that had this kind of tube in it, and that meant getting a 50 watt amp or a 100 watt amp.
And turn it all the way up.
Yeah, and dealing with that volume problem some way. And like I said, people took different approaches to dealing with that. And because if you didn't do that, you just weren't going to get that sound. And in, like I said, 1981, Marshall comes out with the first JCM 800, which has a second gain stage, which lets you shift some of that power amp distortion to the preamp. So you're blending now preamp and power amp distortion, and you can get, you know, a distorted sound. You could argue not exactly the same one, a distorted sound at a more reasonable volume.
Okay.
The first run of those things, I believe it was interesting because I remember very vividly. If you turn the early JCM 800s all the way up, you couldn't get what you were getting on the earlier Marshalls. It still had preamp gain in the circuit, so you couldn't get that highly overdriven sound. You got a different kind of sound. It became more about preamp gain, and the other aspect was that let me see here,
So yeah, you got
that Mesa started
so
developing amps, and they also
so you got like you don't just have one volume button. You have another volume button on the preamp, right? That's the difference.
yeah, right. So you could keep your volume all the way low, right? If you imagine on your Marshall or whatever amp you're talking about, you keep your volume on one, your main volume on one, and you turn your gain all the way up.
Right.
You're hearing the preamp tube distort, and it has a very different sound. It has a buzzy sound. It's not this big, warm, clean, thumping sound. Now,
Okay.
if you do the opposite, if you turn the volume all the way up, and the gain, I guess, you turn it up enough, you're getting more. To get that power amp's saturation, you need to turn the regular volume up.
Right.
So at the same time Marshall was coming out with this, actually before Marshall was coming out with this, I think, Mesa Boogie started coming out with an amp that was also had a different gain stage from the power amp. And the difference with Mesa Boogie was they were using a different tube. They were using a tube called the 6L6.
Okay.
And that is a classic. The 6L6 is associated with classic Mesa tones. They also now use EL34s in some rectifiers and some of those amplifiers. Mesa has used.
What's a good example of like a typical sound that comes out of that tube?
One of the earliest Mesa Boogie users was Carlos Santana. If you can think of what his lead tone sounds like. Got the guys in Steely Dan were using those. Dream Theater and Metallica use those for metal sounds. It's a slightly different sound. The 6L6 tube is also an American-built tube, and it's sometimes referred to as the American sound as opposed to the EL34, which is the British sound.
Mm.
The 6L6 is basically a more versatile tube than the EL34. It produces less obvious saturation when pushed. It's better for cleans. It shines in clean applications. So if you're not doing dyno style music, you can use those tubes and get a lot more versatility.
Do Fender applications use those, or Fender amplifiers
Yeah,
use those?
Fenders have used those too.
Okay.
And I should also stipulate that on occasion Marshall has strayed from EL34s. It's never usually been a good idea for them, but for the most part, they've always been an EL34 sound. They've played around with other tubes when it was harder to get EL34s and stuff like that, but those particular models were less successful and less characteristic, I think.
What's a good example of a Marshall model that had those?
When there was a stage in the mid '70s when they had some difficulty getting EL34s for whatever reason for the American market, and the Marshalls that were coming over, it might have been like they were making them fine for in Europe, but when they were sending the ones to America for a brief period, they had a tube in them called the 6550, which was a bigger tube that didn't distort anywhere near as early as the EL34 did. So you crank that thing up and it wouldn't get distorted, it
Ah,
would stay cleaner. And people were like, "What the hell is this?"
so it's not what you want for the dyno tone.
No, no. So I mean, the people who who bought those amps realized quickly if they were after the sound they thought they were getting, they weren't getting it. But that things like that happened for a while. I don't think the original Marshall that really put the name on the map, that was the Blues Breaker combo that Clapton played when he was in John Mayall. I think that thing didn't have EL34s in it. That was a 1965 combo that I think it had KT88s or 66s in it or something like that. It didn't have EL34s, but it still sounded great. But for the most part, again, it's an EL34 sound. And the reason, like I'm trying to continue to talk about this in terms of the tube type instead of the brand, is because if you buy another amp that isn't the Marshall and it's got EL34s in it, you're probably going to be able to get this tone.
Right. And that
Whether
makes sense.
whether you pick up an old Laney or whether you pick up a Bogner or a Friedman or something like that, that's a boutique copy of a Marshall or something like that, an orange amp, you're going to get EL34s, you're going to get that tone.
Right.
And then it's just a matter of how much bass and treble you want, and the voicing and all of that. But you will get those kinds of tones.